God thinks you're a waste of flesh. Oh, oh, God prefers an atheist. Oh, oh, God, God, God thinks all people like you are hateful. God thinks all people like you are an embarrassment to creation. Self-righteous, judgmental, first to throw a stone and using his name for your own protection.
Hello folks, Stone Dog here, and this is going to be a response to the Vine Rhymes Evolution Blown Away Like Dust in the Wind. Well, first off, you talk about vestigial organs and how, well, you know, like the human appendix has been shown to have function, so therefore it can't be a vestigial organ. Well, I'm afraid evolutionarily speaking you are incorrect. What a vestigial organ is, evolutionary speaking, is a organ that has lost its original function. Now, that's not to say that it's a completely useless organ. In fact, you would suspect that organs that become vestigial will either completely go away, although they completely away, or it would be hijacked and used for another organ, similar to how fins were hijacked and turned into feet for walking around on the earth. And there's plenty of transitional fossils to prove this. I'll post a link up there if you want to go check it out. Now, the next thing he talks about is addressing this used much as everybody else on YouTube. You talk about the fact that bacteria in the lab, when they develop antibiotic resistances, when you put them back out in the real world, they die out. And you're saying that this is proof against evolution. Well, again, it shows your ignorance of the understanding of evolution. In fact, this is the kind of thing that evolution would predict would happen. Why? Well, because evolution predicts that organisms will adapt and evolve to the environment which they find themselves in, and in those bacteria find themselves in the conditions of a lab, where in fact they have absolutely no other competition except antibiotics to kill them. So the only thing they have to do, they can completely become weak against fighting other bacteria as they become stronger in fighting antibiotics. This is the kind of thing that would be predicted by evolution, and it would predict that when you put them back out in the real world, they die off because they're not evolved to deal with that kind of a circumstance. So they either revert back to their old state or they die off, which is exactly what you're seeing in the lab. The next thing you talk about is human chromosome 2, and I guess what you're trying to say is, oh well, human chromosome 2 was originally what missing from apes was that there was a fusion in ours, and I guess your point is, well, that's just how it happened and we just common designer, which is what I assume you're trying to say. The problem with that is that for evolution to have been true, and this would have completely falsified evolution, if we couldn't find this fusion, if we couldn't find this thing, evolution would have been proven completely false. Yet, coincidentally enough, we actually seem to find it. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me if evolution isn't true. And you could try to say, oh well, it was just a common designer, so we started out originally with the same chromosomes as the apes, and then we just fused two of our own and we were still separate. But like I said, that's a pretty strong coincidence to me. And the next thing you talk about is the retroviral DNA sequences. And as far as I understand of the experimental data, what there really is there's like a specific set of genes for which these viruses can insert themselves. And the big problem is I don't think they've ever seen in a lab where the same virus working on the same cells inserted itself in the exact same position as it did previously. Now, it might get it right beside it, it might get it pretty close, but I don't believe the experimental data shows them to have ever actually hit the exact same place, or if that is the case, extremely rare for that to happen. And the problem is we share many of these similarities with apes. So you would think that the chances of it being coincidental are astronomical. Far more, in fact, and I'll point you to a video, than the whole cell just kind of magically forming out of nowhere, which is what y'all like to talk about. Oh yeah, the cell just couldn't possibly have come out of nowhere like that. It's too improbable. Well, these retroviruses are even more improbable to have all occurred in the same spot, so you know. Two, another thing about these retroviral DNAs, when you compare us and apes and and monkeys and frogs, you come up with a tree, a phylogenetic tree, based on these traits that's completely independent. It's completely based on these retroviral DNA similarities. And you come up with a tree based on the genetic similarities and differences of these things. And you have other disciplines of science looking at morphological traits from the fossil record, and they come up with a tree. And there's other ones too. I won't go into a lot of detail. And what happens, oddly enough, is that when they compare the two, they're matched perfectly. This seems a little more than just coincidence if evolution isn't true. And I think the last thing you talked about is a bit about the flood. I may have missed something in there. Sorry if I did. But this is good enough. You talk about the rock layers and how they supposedly, you showed this video, how they could have supposedly formed through just the sediments just kind of piling up. There's a couple of problems with this. For one thing, what you're talking about is each sediment in this hole that's coming down and washing into the river would all sort themselves out. So there'd be this kind of sediment here, a different kind of sediment here, and a different kind of sediment here, and a different kind of sediment here, each containing different kinds of species. And I mean, I'm not a geological expert, but I'm pretty sure that you can get similar layers piled on top of each other. So this doesn't make any sense, because you'd think they would all, throughout the entire world, because this was a worldwide event that created these, you'd have this kind of sediment here with these specific things in it, this kind of sediment here with these specific things in it. You never find this sediment over down here. I'm pretty sure you do, but I'm not an expert on that. But here's another problem. This global catastrophe, and you might make the consensus of that you would see mostly the things at the bottom all the same because they live there, but this wouldn't make any sense on the rest of the planet's surface where the dinosaurs and the humans were all walking around and not trying to kill each other. They all live in the exact same place, so you would think at least occasionally you'd find a human with a dinosaur or vice versa, but you never see this in any of the layers. Why? Because that's not what happened. It wasn't a worldwide event that created these. And in fact, another thing you'd think of it as a worldwide event, that you'd have a worldwide pattern extremely similar. You don't. You see extreme irregularity in these layers. You see some places where one layer is just barely big enough to see, and you see some layers where that same layer is missing, and some places in the world where that layer is 10 feet tall. This doesn't make any sense on a global flood, because you would have this all evenly distributed and all evenly laid out on the entire surface of the earth, which is exactly, like I said, what you don't see. In fact, the only explanation for what you do see is, even if this was what you were talking about in that video was true, it would still have happened at different times in different places over a large period of time to create these layers.